Hello everyone and welcome to the National Army Museum for this week's Friday Insight. Here at the museum is the national home of history and heritage of the Army, a place where you can experience the story of the Army from the perspective of those who have served in it. There are many ways you can support the museum. You can buy a book in our shop, visit the cafe, donate, or become a member, where you can get exclusive discounts and your very own events programme. Today, I am delighted to welcome Susan Ward. Susan is the head of art at the National Army Museum and specialises in 19th century art and military silver. Susan is a member of the Decorative Art Society and the co-author of Silver City, 500 Years of Portsmouth's History. Today, she will discuss our new major exhibition on Victorian military art, focusing on the representation of soldiers in the late 19th century. There will be time for questions at the end of the discussion for both online and in person. For our online audience, post questions in the Q&A chat bar, and we will put these to the speaker at the end. Moving on to some technical points. Should we encounter any technical issues, we will work to rectify them, but if your stream freezes, we suggest refreshing your browser solves most issues. A member of the team will always be active in the chat bar should you need any help. With all that said, I'll now pass over to Susan. I hope you will enjoy the talk, and thank you very much for coming. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be here and see so many people today. Today I'm going to talk about the new exhibition, Myth and Reality, Military Art in the Age of Queen Victoria, with a focus on the representation of soldiers. As context, I want to start with the 17th century and to look at some of the early influences. Military art had flourished in the Netherlands and France since the end of the 16th century. The influence of artists such as Van Dyck, Rubens, and Jacques Callot set the standards for this type of art. By the 1640s, portraiture was also a highly developed art form in England, and as such, it was common to use battle scenes as backdrops for portraits of soldiers, with the foreground being occupied by the king and his generals. While French military art contributed to the development of regal martial art, it was the influence of the Flemish and Dutch artists after 1660 that provided the catalyst for military art in Britain. So here we have Battle of the Boyne by Jan Wyck. So Jan Wyck was one of these artists who had settled in England for patronage. William III had long admired artists like Wyck, who had glorified his victories in Europe. His campaigns in Ireland from 1689 to 92 were the ideal subject matter for artistic opportunity. This is the Battle of the Boyne, on the 12th of July, 1690, painted by Jan Wyck. Wyck accompanied William on the Irish campaigns, but there's no real evidence to suggest he was present on the battlefield. Research, however, does suggest that Wyck painted many versions of this battle to include the encampments and equestrian portraits of William in conflict with James II. Jan Wyck was a key figure in the development of British military and naval art in England, and a huge influence on British artists. He was tutor to the artist John Wootton, and you can clearly see the influence and style. Here we have the Battle of Blenheim by John Wootton, painted in circa 1743. It depicts the defeat of a French and Bavarian force under the allied English, Dutch, and Austrian armies, commanded by the Duke of Marlborough and Prince Eugene of Savoy. The battle, in many ways, is a perfect example of the strength of an allied coordination and operation. The victorious Marlborough is seen on his chestnut horse. You can just kind of see him on the right-hand side, while the captured French commander, Marshal Tallard, leaves the battlefield in Marlborough's carriage, which is kind of slightly further back in the middle there. Needless to say, John Wootton attracted the attention of noble patrons and many commissions for representations of battles and soldiers. During the first half of the 18th century, he was the leading landscape, equestrian, and battle artist in England. And I just wanted to point out that this painting is actually on permanent display in the Europe Gallery, if you want to kind of go and have a real study of it. So we fast forward a little bit to the 1750s, and we still very much have the soldier as the main focus of attention. Here we have two examples by Joshua Reynolds and Benjamin West. The portrait on the left shows Field Marshal Legionet in his prestigious uniform of the Royal Regiment of the Horse Guards with sash and badge and the Order of the Bath. There's a lovely quote by historian Peter Harrington in reference to early military portraits and the representation of soldiers in the 18th century. And he says, soldiering was a new experience for many, and the opportunity to pose wearing the paraphernalia of war was one that could not be missed. On the right, we have the death of General Wolfe, painted after Benjamin West, highlighting a continued fascination with the soldier hero. But for extra dramatic effect, we've got a depiction of the death on the battlefield. This one is also in the Formation Gallery, again, if you'd like to kind of spend some time having a look at it. So then we arrive into the 19th century and the reign of Queen Victoria, and very much the backdrop for the Myth and Reality exhibition. So here we have Sir Arthur Wellesley, the first Duke of Wellington, was one of the greatest generals, best remembered for defeating Napoleon's forces at Waterloo in 1815. On the left, we have an imaginary scene painted in 1840. Wellington is represented at the end of his career surveying the Battle of Waterloo. This was painted by Benjamin Haydon, and the work was intended to convey patriotic sentiment rather than documenting any historic event. It also highlights the enduring fascination with Wellington that the Victorians kept going back to with their art. Painting on the right is also Wellington, but as a young soldier, just sort of in the early years of his career. And he's here in Saron in the Pyrenees in 1813. It was also painted by Thomas Jones Barker, who is an artist who had gained great commercial success through military depictions of soldiers and his mass sort of printmaking. I think the most interesting thing here is that the painting on the right was painted a year after Wellington's death in 1853. So the artist is very much choosing to retrospectively commemorate one of Wellington's victories during the Peninsular War and to kind of go back to that heroic status. So I think it's fair to say that few British artists before 1854 were actually allowed to witness war firsthand and could never really come close to imagining its true impact or violence. That, however, didn't deter artists for continuing to represent soldiers and battle-themed works. For example, here we join the 6th or the 1st Royal Warwickshire Regiment on foot on exercise while stationed at Portsmouth. And this was painted by a local artist to Portsmouth, Daniel Cunliffe. We kind of think circa 1843. So this is one of the earliest paintings you'll see in the exhibition. It's a really interesting kind of fly-on-the-wall kind of view of military tactics. And you kind of feel like you're sort of seeing something that maybe is ordinarily just kept for the military. So what the artist has done, he's created a kind of wishbone formation, and with a whole kind of intent to create a sense of the soldiers aligned as one force and working together. Also, I think what's really striking is the image of the red coat and the red jackets, often with the white trousers, of course, become a predominant feature for centuries. The red, of course, having been used since the mid-17th century and representing tradition and England for generations to follow. So approximately 10 years later from this painting, we go to 1853. or 1853, and the Battle of Alma. And what is really interesting here, British military art still remains the dominant visual reference for documenting the British Army. This is also the time of the Crimean War, and that in itself provided a rich source of subject matter for military artists. The Crimean War was probably the first war to be visually recorded, and where artists were commissioned actively to go and document and record sort of the battle or the history as it was unraveling. Here we have, again, the Battle of Alma on the 20th of September, 1854, as painted by Edmund Walker. It's the first action of the Crimean War took place when British and French forces found their route to the naval base of Sevastopol, blocked at the Alma River. The 7th Royal Fusiliers and the Coldstream Guards are depicted here attacking Russian-held heights. The action has been compressed by the artist, again, probably going back to if you remember the previous work, to show British regiments simultaneously storming the Great Redoubt or fortification. So it really does look like there's this indomitable force, and it's very, very effective dramatic tool. And probably historically, the regiments did this on their own separate thing, but the artist has done it to kind of create that real sense of impact. And if this is coming back to Britain as well, it's a statement of intent, certainly. So a year later, this is 1855. William Simpson is an artist who has been commissioned to go to Crimea by printmakers. And his commission is to sketch the British Army and military manoeuvres. And what is really interesting about Simpson, so unlike other artists who have been paid by the newspapers or for propaganda, he is very much being paid to be a very visual documentary, provide a very visual documentary reference of what the army were doing. His work was seen as having no political bias, no propaganda, anything like that. Just a very, very true to life observation of what the British Army were doing in Crimea. And his work was revered so much that Lord Raglan saw these drawings, approved them, and all of these sketches were allowed to travel back in Lord Raglan's official dispatch bag to England, upon which then Queen Victoria and the Secretary of War at the time were able to approve them and kind of give them their approval. All of the watercolours then eventually ended up in a huge tome that really was meant for no other reason than just to be a visual history. And again, back in Britain around the same time, we have images like these two examples here with Queen Victoria as Commander-in-Chief of the British Army, with the aim very much of gathering support for soldiers and highlighting the hardships of ordinary soldiers. So we've got her meeting veterans coming back from Crimea and presenting a Crimean War medal. But certainly it would have, these kind of images in the Illustrated London News and the graphic would have certainly been used to create advocacy and patriotism for the army. So 2 years later, in 1857, we're still kind of looking at Crimea as the dominant source material. The soldier hero image that artists like John Wotton and Benjamin West alluded to in the 18th century is still a predominant trend in military art. Even in defeat, as depicted here, the British soldier is represented as heroic and dignified. This is the capitulation of Kars on the 20th of November, 1855. and painted by the artist Thomas Jones Barker. In June 1855, the city of Kars in northeast Turkey was besieged by a Russian army of 25,000 soldiers. The defense of Kars was led by William Fenwick Williams. You can kind of see him on the chestnut horse in the center, a British military commissioner who had served with the Turkish army for many years. The garrison repelled 3 major attacks, but disease, famine, and a shortage of ammunition forced it to surrender. The scene that you can kind of see here depicts the soldiers just before being taken captive at the hands of the Russians. The British officers were eventually released and allowed to return to England, and when they came back home, were of course welcomed back as heroes. And subsequent lithographs and engravings were mass published in all of the weekly illustrated newspapers to highlight the kind of their heroic endeavours. So around the same time, we have a very different depiction of a soldier. This watercolour was painted by Colonel George Cadogan while serving in Crimea. It's very much meant to be an allegory, or a kind of daydream, if you like, with the shadow of Wellington consoling Lord Raglan, with thoughts of duty and country. You can kind of see the words duty and country kind of coming through on the sunlight. As a younger man, Raglan served with the Duke of Wellington's staff and at Waterloo. Cadogan's watercolour here references the relationship between the two soldiers and imagines Wellington consoling Raglan after receiving word of defamatory articles in the British press. You can see, if you know, the title of the works, the slightly old-fashioned usage, the calumnies of the press. So I think the press had heavily criticised Raglan for various strategic decisions, and Cadogan was obviously aware of the press, and he's kind of just creating this nice sort of scene of, if only Wellington could talk to Raglan, what would he say? By 1857, the Crimean War had ended, but the Indian Rebellion was well underway, and the subject for military art endures. This painting by the same artist, Thomas Jones Barker, it's deliberately very dark, depicting daybreak. When news of an uprising in the Bengal Army reached England in July 1857, Lieutenant General Campbell, later Lord Clyde, was appointed Commander-in-Chief in India. And the painting, this scene depicts him and his staff on reconnaissance in the dawn before his attack on the 14th of November in 1857. So here we have another very commercially orientated artist. This is Henry Nelson O'Neill, and you may well know this image. It's one of the most famous images of the British Army in the 19th century. This scene captures the moment of soldiers returning back from fighting in the Indian Rebellion. And it's a very Victorian chocolate box kind of over-romanticized image, and you either love it or hate it like Marmite. But it very much tapped into the Victorian people's kind of appeal to the ordinary people and how it had affected the families, perhaps, of soldiers returning. And it sort of impacted the effects of the impact of service. And it's got a slight sort of biblical style to it again, which is very, very much of this period. So some 10 years later, and in the 1870s, we have our introduction to the work of Lady Butler, one of the most significant battle artists of the 19th century. And a quote from her to set the scene. "What proved of great importance to me this year of 1872 was my introduction, if I may put it so, to the British Army. I then saw the British soldier as I had never had the opportunity of seeing him before. My father took me to see something of the autumn manoeuvres near Southampton. Subjects for watercolour drawings appeared in abundance to my delighted observation. A year later, she started working on the painting, which ended up being one of her most famous works. And she's quoted in also saying, "I called Saturday, December the 13th, 1873, a red letter day, for I then began my picture, The Roll Call, at my London studio. This is where I painted the picture, which brought me such utterly unexpected celebrity." And she went on to say, "Mr. Burchett, my previous headmaster, sent me the best models, nearly all ex-soldiers. One in particular, who had been in the Crimea, was invaluable. He stood for the sergeant who calls the roll, and I engaged with my models for 5 hours each day, often asking them to give me an extra half an hour. She also noticed each figure was drawn in first without the great heavy coat, my models posing in a tight shell jacket so as to get the figure well drawn first. How easily then could the thick, less shapely greatcoat be painted on the well-secured foundations?" So on the left, we have a study of a guardsman. This is from the collection here. And then on the right, we've got the finished painting, The Roll Call. So the chap on the left, he's a study for one of the central figures there you can see with the bandage around his head. And this belongs to the Royal Collection, but we have it on loan as part of the exhibition, so please do go and see it. It depicts the aftermath of a battle fought during the Crimean winter, and in the light of morning, we see the remnants of a battalion of Grenadier Guards. It's a very, very poignant painting, actually, when you look at it. I think it's also very important to note that this is painted almost 20 years since Crimea actually happened. So it's just to kind of highlight that enduring fascination of battle art that remained a real constant with Victorian popular culture. Following the success of the roll call, Queen Victoria commissioned another painting, The Defence of Rorke's Drift, to specifically capture the battle, but also specific soldiers. This depicts the 24th or 2nd Warwickshire Regiment in action in South Africa. Rorke's Drift was a mission statement, partly used as a field hospital. In 1879, during the Anglo-Zulu War, it was defended by a British garrison of 141 against approximately 4,000 Zulu soldiers. 11 Victoria Cross medals were awarded, the highest number for a single action. Surviving soldiers recreated the action for Lady Butler following the regiment's return to Portsmouth. Apparently, when the regiment came back to Britain, they had 2 jobs. One was to meet Queen Victoria, and the other was to pose for Lady Butler. She recalled when she went to Portsmouth, "I was counselled to give Her Majesty the description of every single figure. She knew them all by name, for I had managed to show all the Victoria Cross winners." And this painting is fascinating, so if you do get a chance to go into the exhibition, please see it, because while it's very dramatic and you can feel the heat and everything, it's very much a painting of individual portraits. So it feels like she's done an individual person and kind of set them on the background. The portraits themselves are very striking, and the uniforms, and just a very, very highly detailed painting. In the middle, we have Majors Chard and Bromhead, who posed for her, actually. They're there in the middle. And she had commented how Major Chard had fidgeted and wouldn't sit properly when she tried to kind of sketch him. On the left, we have a sketch, a very early sketch from Rorke's and we have this on display alongside the actual painting as well. So the exhibition's a great opportunity to kind of bring sketchbooks and things that haven't ordinarily been on display for a very long time alongside the final masterpiece. So you can kind of really see the artist's process. So here we have, moving forward slightly, here we have the charge of the 21st Lancers at Omdurman in Sudan in 1898. It's painted by Edward Matthew Hale, and I've included it here for two reasons. Firstly, the Battle of Omdurman is famous for what is now often described as the last major cavalry charge by the British Army and one of the last in military history. The 21st Lancers, numbering around 400 men, were sent to clear the plain ahead of the main Anglo-Egyptian force. They initially expected to encounter only a small group of dervishes. However, there was a surprise ambush. As they charged, they discovered a hidden nor, or a dry waterhouse or gully, from which around 2,500 dervish infantrymen suddenly rose. And this is the scene that the artist has captured here. What was originally intended as a sweep quickly escalated into a desperate hand-to-hand fight. The other reason for including this image is that Winston Churchill at the time was also attached to the 21st Lancers and in the thick of this chaotic charge. We think the central character may in fact be Churchill on the grey horse. He famously armed himself with a Mauser C96 pistol, which he had purchased privately rather than his sword, believing it would be more effective in the close quarters melee. He fired his pistol and used his sword in what was a brutal, though brief, encounter. Churchill was also a war correspondent for the Morning Post. His vivid dispatches from the Sudan, including the account for the charge and the battle, were later incorporated into his 2-volume book, The River War, published in 1899, also the same year of this painting. So it'd be interesting. I don't know actually if the artist was on site while this happened or whether he used Churchill's vivid accounts to kind of recreate the scene. Finally, we're going to end up a little bit under time, which is good. This is the last slide I wanted to show you. So here we have Lord Kitchener saluting troops while in South Africa in 1902. Horatio Kitchener became one of Britain's most celebrated soldiers, driving the army's rapid expansion. His image was used extensively going into the First World War recruiting campaign, and it highlights a very long service through the reign of Queen Victoria and beyond. He's a really significant end to the exhibition, highlighting how his long service kind of started in the Victorian reign, has now ended up going through into First World War. So that's I think a quick, hopefully, roundup of the exhibition. Like everything, the best thing is to actually go and stand in front of some of these works of art to really capture the sense of what the artists are trying to do and their motivations as well. And we're very, very pleased to have the 2 works on loan from the Royal Collection. They're very significant military works of art, so please do go and see them if you get a chance. Thank you very much for listening.